Quietly beside the Vamco River, Huang'an Prison is where the warm morning sunlight blankets the green rice fields. The rows of bamboo on the riverside rustle in the gentle air from a distance, resembling a painting. The peacefulness of the Vietnamese countryside hides a completely different world, one in which lost people are imprisoned under the strict discipline of life in the camp located behind the towering walls and strong iron gates. The prisoner wakes up to the sound of the work gong in quiet and then returns to his frigid cell. The blackness of the night is dispersed only by low but profound light from a lamp that shines as steadily and boringly as a clock that never fails. Those fatigued eyes still exhibited those fuzzy rays of light, perhaps regret and a faint hope for a day of rebuilding life. But one morning, that quiet series of days was suddenly broken. Lei, the nurse who works at the prison, stepped out of the medical room looking pale. She had the test results of a prisoner, which was a surprise to everyone. She was pregnant. The word of Lan spread across every wall like a cold wind. This usually neat and orderly hospital became the subject of gossip after 4 identical instances were discovered within a month. The warden, who had spent over 20 years maintaining order in the prison, whispered in a voice that was both hesitant and anxious. She quietly examined each copy in her office where the light was flickering. Huang A prison's sense of security, which was once considered unbreakable, has fluctuated and now appears to be under danger from an unknown threat that no one is able to comprehend. That night, Mrs. Thon sat quietly and looked out the window. She found herself in a deserted courtyard where the moonlight fell on the cold walls. She wondered how such a thing could happen in a closed place. Who were the pregnant prisoners? Why did they remain silent? The image of the prisoner's worried eyes flashed through her mind like a haunting reminder that the answer might be far beyond her wildest imagination. The news about the pregnant prisoners spread throughout Huang'an Prison. It was like a gentle wind blowing through every cold cell, every quiet hallway, and every pair of eyes. After becoming acclimated to that surrender, it was no longer a storm. Although the news is loud, the undercurrents are mild and are creeping into everyone's heart, from prisoners to guards. Even while people do not say it out loud, there are furtive stares, sighs, and skeptical eyes. It is not only a story about other people, it is also a reflection of their own vulnerability. Each of these mysterious hostages makes the environment here feel more oppressive than it has ever been. Who will be the next one? Even the hardest people cannot hide their worry. Young girls speak in the dark corners with their anxious eyes, not daring to look straight at anyone, while the elder convicts attempt to appear calm by shaking their heads slightly. They are closely monitoring every step in this closed area. Their hands were shaking, which was a telling sign. The jail warden maintained her usual stern demeanor even during all of this chaos. Nevertheless, deep down, she was becoming increasingly anxious, as if the earth beneath her feet was no longer stable. Ms. has lived here her whole life, maintaining discipline and order. Thant does not let any disorder thrive. Sitting in her office under the dim light of the lamp, she contemplates the sent reports. She neatly organized the table. As I read each paragraph, it seemed to get heavier. She said this in an urgent conference with the jail guards, her voice, though not loud, resonating with enormous weight. Like hammer strikes, the belief in Huang'an's inviolability had to clear this matter. After that, orders were given to install additional cameras in every area, including well-known places like the cafeteria and labor yard, as well as the most tranquil garden. She emphasized that it was necessary to keep a close watch in order to avoid overlooking anything, her cold eyes scanning the area as if to ensure that no one was permitted to be careless. The young nurse Lei, who was assigned a different task, had a gentle demeanor and a friendly smile, and she was frequently adored by the inmates as a confidant. Than believed that she would be the right person to take care of the task. She approaches convicts and listens to things they may not want to tell anyone else. Normally, she initiates her work with light conversations and questions that appear straightforward, but require careful guidance. However, the only response she received was a long silence or vague replies. "I can't think of anything," one prisoner mumbled in a voice so low it nearly disappeared. Despite their best efforts, they could not keep their eyes hidden. She was trying to hide her fear and discomfort, but in the midst of those strange faces, Love focused on one person in particular. Ngan, this little child, would frequently sit at the window and stare blankly at the yard. The tranquil temperament was different from that of other detainees in insecurity without Ngan. As he sat opposite the elderly woman, Le noticed that she had a secret hidden beneath her eyes, in addition to the sadness that she was feeling. I attempted to start a conversation in a kind manner, but Ngan simply lowered her head and held her hands together tightly, causing her knuckles to turn white. "If something happens, please let me know. I am here to help you." The camera detected tears while reviewing the film. This prompted her to pause for an extended period on the small screen, displaying familiar scenes until a quiet individual entered the corridor. Those undercurrents will keep growing and wash everything away. Ngan had a strange tendency that set him apart from the other detainees. Every late afternoon, she would quietly stroll to the bamboo garden, a seldom visited corner of the campus. When the camera arrived, it only captured a small portion of the bamboo garden. Ngan moved slowly but with purpose, as if she were concerned that any noise may reveal the secret she was attempting to keep hidden. Ngan's eyes moved away from the garden. Lee was especially attracted to the look of someone who was carrying deep ideas, as opposed to the aimless stare of someone who was used to living a constrained life. Lei felt uneasy looking into those eyes since they appeared to be trying to say something. I can't describe what is here for her, but there is something. That night, I stayed awake because of my tears. She remembered every time Ngan's head turned on the recording. She experienced a feeling in her heart that was impossible to understand. It was a combination of curiosity and anger. Was also afraid that there was something more dangerous hidden beneath the prison's seemingly peaceful and bright appearance. Without hesitation, I decided to personally inspect the bamboo garden the following morning. That afternoon, the bamboo garden was bathed in gorgeous golden sunlight, and the atmosphere was so peaceful that I felt like I was walking into a picture. The wind blows gently through the tall bamboo trees, creating rustling sounds that are similar to whispers in nature. Her shoes glided quietly over the thick layers of dry leaves that lay beneath her feet. Her eyes examined the dense bushes that surrounded her, and the garden became denser in the depths. Suddenly, the tears halted in front of her. An unfamiliar tightness overcame her, slowing her down despite her deep sense of tranquility. A bamboo bush was the biggest of the other bushes. It had thick leaves, as if it were attempting to conceal something that was underneath. As it approached her heart, its presence intensified. The harsh rhythm reverberated through her chest like an indistinct threat. She bent down and gently pushed the bamboo shoots aside with her hands. A warm, musty smell wafted through the air, mingling with the heavy odor of soil that had not been disturbed for a while beneath the surface. The bush was a small wooden door that was buried behind roots that were stuck to the earth. It looked like it belonged to a time long ago, and it showed signs of having been there for a long time, such as ancient lines and rotting wood. The secret buried with time felt cold all over, like the last piece of a puzzle that had just been dropped and opened up a picture. This was not due to the wind, but rather the door. Mrs. Than's face appeared to become heavier than it had ever been before, and her eyes sharpened as though she were judging every word that Lee spoke. She stood up straight and inhaled, attempting to calm the sensation of excitement that was building in her heart. Without any hesitation, She went back to report to Mrs. Than. At last she stood up, her voice quiet but strong. "We need to check immediately. Nothing can cover the scope." That afternoon, Mrs. Than Lee and a few guards returned to the bamboo garden in a small group, all of them under the crimson sunset. Every step felt like a reminder of the heavy worry they were feeling. Everyone was staring at the small entryway that was located beneath the tree roots around the enormous shrub. Mrs. Than signaled to a guard to start digging up the soil layer so that the wooden door could be revealed more accurately. The second guard yanked the piece hard, causing the door to creak as the old wood descended below. The girl held her breath as she felt every cell in her body stiffen up. She was in a small, dark tunnel that was narrow and deep, as if it went to another world where light and truth never touched the air. The air in the tunnel was chilly, as if an invisible hand had just touched her. The area surrounding them appeared to be holding its breath, and so did the entire group. Misses in the low light of the afternoon, when the sun was only a faint red stripe on the horizon, this tunnel was not only a passage, but also a door that opened to a mystery far greater than they could have imagined. The investigation team stood silently before a surprising discovery: a small wooden door that was revealed to be old and rotten with time, hidden beneath the dense bushes. Using a crowbar to force the door open, Than signaled for one of the guards to come forward. The sudden, loud creaking noise took everyone by surprise. The light never reached the air in the cellar. It was cold and heavy, carrying the musty scent of time, the peculiar soil that had been sealed for a long time, and the breath of a secret that was gradually being disclosed under the door. As she bent down to examine deep in the basement, it felt like the shadows were whispering to her, telling her the story they had kept hidden for so many years. Was that this? The voice was speaking so softly that only she could hear it. Mrs. Than rose. As she looked along the old brick wall, she realized that the things that were in front of her were never simple. With a deep yet forceful voice, she commanded the flashlight to turn on, even though the light was dim. She understood, having honed her skills through many years of practice. Despite the passage of people on the walkway, the tunnel's bricks remained broken and covered in moss. The gang discovered that this tunnel connected the basement of the women's prison to a vacant area on the opposite side of the river after conducting an inquiry for a period of time. This was not a coincidence. Her eyes, filled with both sadness and happiness, stood in front of the door. She was curious and lightly ran her fingers over the cold brick wall, as if she wanted to feel everything it had witnessed over the years. The construction of this tunnel could have occurred during World War II. She interrupted the silence by talking. It started out as a sanctuary or escape route, but it eventually developed into something more. Mrs. Than looked into An's eyes, which were filled with tears of concern. If Lei was right, this bunker was both a remnant of the past and the answer to the prison's weeks-long mystery about pregnant prisoners. She had once dismissed this as impossible, but now it appeared to hold a clue. However, at the same time, her responsibility had become greater than ever. We need to accurately determine who is using this tunnel and why they are doing so. Ms. Than spoke in a slow and careful manner, as if she were talking to herself. Her voice was frequently rigid. She knew there was still a long way to go until everything was resolved, but in her heart, she felt a strange sense of sympathy for the people who had come to this tunnel. People who might be yearning for what life had taken away, love and freedom. She now felt a mix of strength and resoluteness with a hint of exhaustion. Therefore do, and even though this narrative will take her wherever she goes, Lee believes that the determination gradually becomes apparent. She understands that she must confront reality and the positive aspects of humanity, even in the most challenging circumstances. Despite the unusual environment they inhabit, she finds a small amount of hope. Ngan entered the management room with her shoulders slumped over. The little child shrank back, as if trying to avoid the gazes of the other people in the room. The door clicked shut behind her, isolating her from the outside world and compelling her to confront the truth that awaited her. Mrs. Than would sit at the head of the table with a serious expression on her face, her cold eyes watching Ngan's every move. The only person in the room with a soft face was standing next to her, yet even her eyes showed that she was feeling something. Ngan was anxious. Ngan lowered her head, her fists tightly clenched, her knuckles white, and she remained silent. She simply stood there silently like a ghost. She leaned down slightly, and her voice was soft but enough to break the tense atmosphere. Ngan, you do not need me. Simply be honest. Our office does not wish to make your life any more difficult. Everything will be easier for everyone. Ngan did not say a word, and her eyes remained fixed on her trembling hands. Time seemed to stop, except the sound of the clock ticking stayed. Ngan wept and burst into tears. Her screams rang loudly in the room, small as a hurricane that just tore through her face. The song's sound resonated slowly in the space of tears that were eagerly waiting for her eyes. Her tears fell silently, flowing down her cheeks like leaves, but her shoulders stopped shaking. Ngan turned her head to face Lei, her voice breaking as she did so, and tears filled her eyes. I desired to see him, but it was not within my authority to do so. Mrs. Than straightened herself and gave a little grimace, but she did not say anything. Her eyes continued to follow every word. Ngan Lei nodded, Miss Du's words ringing. Dangnu tried to calm the anger that was in the heart of a girl. "Who is he?" Ngan inquired. Ngan took a deep breath after downloading and tried to stay calm. "He was my darling before I came here. What is your job?" She stopped speaking. Her words stuck in her mouth. Tears streamed down her face as she gently placed her hand on the table, not forcing anything, but to let her know that she was not alone. While doing yard work, fishermen who live in the opposite hamlet that we promised to wait for discovered a tunnel. Mrs. Than spoke in a voice that was deep and powerful, like a needle breaking the silence. The raven-haired woman nodded without looking up. "Not just me, but also some of the other sisters know that we merely want to find something from our past existence, but no one wants to do it." Ngan's last remarks made the room feel heavier than it ever has before, yet I am still human. Mrs. Than stood up and looked around the room. She looked at Lee and said, "You need to understand that your actions affect yourself and this prison." Her heart constricted. Those reunions were the sole source of hope that prevented them from falling into despair amid the darkness and isolation of the prison. Ngan did not argue back. She lowered her head and continued to cry because of the weight of responsibility. At this point, she was aware that all excuses were pointless. Tears trailed Ngan's small figure as she left the room. Her voice was not rough. That day, the management room was filled with a deep quiet. Each second and minute felt like they were taking longer because of the ticking of the wall clock. Lei asked Ngan to provide an explanation. At first, Ngan lowered her head in silence, but when Lei's patience ran out, she broke down in tears and revealed the truth. Mrs. Than sat across from the manager who had been associated with this location for over 20 years. She was watching Ngan because of the lightning, paying attention to even the tiniest expression. Her fingers were pallid and shaking from the excruciating tension as she held her palms together. She sat there without making a sound. Ngan Lei spoke in a gentle and patient manner, as if she were trying to calm herself down. She sat beside her, her eyes softer but full of anxiety, and the atmosphere in the room was thick, as if everyone were waiting for every word that was going to come out of the little girl's trembling lips. Ngan continued to remain silent and lowered her head. Her hair tumbled down, hiding half of her pale face, but tears noticed her shoulders shaking, and then she heard a stifled sob. Out of nowhere, a scream pierced the silence. "I don't want to make things challenging for you. Simply be honest with me." Tai Lei heard her heart clench in Ngan's eyes. She observed the despair of a person who had reached the brink of hope and agony. Visit meet night, she continued speaking, her voice shaking but clearer than before. We had just finished talking. She occasionally brought me a letter or some other tiny items. Mrs. Ngan did not have the courage to look up, so she bent her head. I'm not the only one. Some of the other sisters are aware that they come to the tunnel to meet their family and romantic partners. But we did not willfully violate. Than's eyes were full of earnestness as she scowled. Those activities, which seemed harmless, have resulted in the current scenario. Others pose security risk beyond our imagination. Ngan dropped her head deeper and tears poured. Each drop fell on the table. I know. We simply wanted to experience something from our previous lives. It looked as though the area had frozen. Her heart felt heavy, not just for Ngan, but for everyone else as well. They are all just folks trying to hold on to a little warmth and a little connection with the life they have lost. However, that yearning has now drawn them into a vortex that they are unable to break free from. We will figure out a solution. That is incorrect. Mrs. Than claimed that her voice got softer, but that she still did not lose her determination. Ngan, you must understand that all of your acts have repercussions. We will not overlook this situation, but we will also not let it continue to do harm. Tears followed as her heart could not help but develop a feeling of bitterness for people like Ngan, who, even if they made mistakes, were only human with desires too typical to be loved. She was aware that she would not only attempt to find a solution, but also to provide those individuals with a glimmer of hope and a sense of humanity in their difficult lives. Even if the path ahead is difficult, a faint light still flickers in the weeping eyes as the darkness outside the chamber falls. The Me people are imprisoned. Their cries are both clear and stifled, like a hello to life that is filled with both joy and grief when those babies are placed in the arms of their mothers. At that moment, time seems to pause. Their children, who were born in prison, are different from other youngsters. Their first cries come from behind locked walls, where they are surrounded by the exhausted and frightened eyes of those who are imprisoned. As the moms left the prison, they waited by the window of the cell and watched their children's silhouettes disappear behind the large gate. They didn't yell or cry loudly. Instead, they calmly gazed at the teary eyes that were filled with love, but also despair outside of the family. My child, with deep remorse, remembers that I love you and will return for you. Those words rang out, but no one could hear them except for them and their wounded hearts. Huang Prison, under the direction of Ms. Thang, has created an extraordinary humanitarian policy that allows mothers to meet periodically. Women who have made mistakes and lost their way now have another aim to live by and strive for. They not only labor to lower their sentences, but they also work to make money and save tiny amounts to buy gifts for children in prison with skillful hands. These sessions are not merely a couple of hours long each month, they are also significant. Mothers in plain jail clothes, who are large in size, are shaking as they hug their children. They are giving gentle instructions and kissing their children as if they want to pour all of their love into that little moment. The mood in the prison begins. My mother is now more cheerful when she talks about her little daughter. Her eyes are a little bit wet, and she will absolutely love it. But more than that, she will be proud since I worked so hard for her. Do you think my child will like this doll, Ngan? We sew each sweater onto the small cloth doll's sister Lei. Mrs. Than felt a sense of relief as she saw those women who were now living with a renewed sense of hope and motivation. They were no longer ashamed of their mistakes. They wanted to start over for their children who had horrific upbringings. She saw faces that were formerly gloomy but now appeared brighter with eyes full of resolve. Years went by. Families raised their children in their embrace. A young man came out of the camp one day when the gate opened. The toddler stood there holding a tiny bunch of flowers and looking about with bright eyes. Years went by. and hope, no matter how small, has the ability to change a person. Huang'an Prison has changed its appearance over the years. The walls have been painted and rows of trees have been planted along the Huang'an campus. These trees now serve as a symbol of the rebirth of hope and compassion in every life that seemed to have been abandoned. The most compelling evidence of the power of forgiveness, opportunity, and love is the person who was born behind high walls. Whenever she walked through the brightly illuminated hallways of the hospital or quietly took notes on a patient's condition, she was reminded of the people who had suffered in the dark. The lights were fresh in her memory. Huang'an continues to haunt her. The old woman led her. Her eyes were wild. She knew that the things she had done in Huang'an, the seemingly insignificant conversations, had left a bigger mark than she had ever thought. At a celebration, when the prison gates opened, those who had passed through this place returned not as prisoners, but as free people, carrying with them gratitude to one person. I wanted to meet you, and I am writing to thank you on behalf of her mother, who often reminded me to do so. I have rediscovered myself thanks to my aunts, and now I live to make amends to my family for what I previously did. In Huang'an, the lost story teaches both those who made mistakes and those who trusted and created opportunities. As she gazed at Mrs. Than and Lei, her eyes brimmed with pride. Hope is eternal. Dear ladies and gentlemen, we sincerely thank you for taking the time to listen to this important and emotional story. In this way, the story not only has emotional moments, but it also contains profound lessons about love, hope, and the strength of forgiveness in life, regardless of the mistakes we make or the significant problems we face. I will see you again in the next stories.